I'm very, very pleased to host and facilitate our webinar, The Synod Document, A Paradigm Shift, ? And this topic came from conversations that have been generated regarding the final Synod document. So we thought we would take a closer look at the document of the Synod of Bishops on Young People, Faith, and Vocational Discernment. And so I am Tracy Lamont. I'm Assistant Professor of Religion and Religious Education here at Loyola Institute for Ministry. And I am co-sponsoring this with Paul Jarzabowski, who works for the Secretariat for Laity. Wait, let me get this right. The United States Catholic Conference of Bishops as the Assistant Director for Youth and Young Adult Ministries in the Secretariat of Laity, Marriage, Family Life, and Youth. And Paul also serves as Staff Liaison for the USCCB National Advisory Team on Young Adult Ministry and is the United States National Coordinator for World Youth Day that just happened a couple weeks ago. How many weeks ago? 2?
About a month.
A month, yeah. I've got no sense of time. And so joining us today, so welcome everyone. Joining us today, we have two of our presenters, and Paul's going to also give some of his insights as well. Our first presenter today, we have Brenda Noriega, and she is the Young Adult Program Coordinator in the Diocese of San Bernardino, and she's been in that role for about a year now. Before that, she was the Hispanic Ministry Coordinator for the Diocese of Fresno, Youth and Young Adult Ministry, and Pastoral Juvenile as well. And so we also have Nick Stein today, and Nick comes to us from Baltimore, who currently serves as the Program Manager for Bon Secours Young Adults, a ministry of the Sisters of Bon Secours in Marriottsville, Maryland. Nick also serves as the chair of the United States Catholic Conference of Bishops National Advisory Team on Young Adult Ministry. So I want to welcome our presenters, welcome you to Paul, and I want to turn it over to everyone here. The first thing we're going to talk about today is really the context. We're going to go in two sections, kind of the context, purpose, and process of the Synod itself and the final document that came out. And then we're going to go into, what does this really look like? What is it we're seeing? What is really in the document that's calling us into young adult ministry, calling us out into ministry? And so, we'll get started here, about talking about the intent, and I think we'll turn it over to Paul first. The intent of the Synod and the final document, and any insights you have and the experiences, particularly Brenda's, which we'll get to in a minute, the experiences that we've had. And I also want to, give a quick reminder before we get started, sorry about that, about the webinar that we hosted back in November, I think it was. Yes. Just coming off of the actual Synod in October, and that was the title of that webinar was "What Didn't Happen at the Synod: Practical Strategies for Next Steps." And that webinar, which we have the link to if anybody missed it, if you registered, and you can still go ahead and register and give us your email. And I'll put the link down here if you want to do that. Anyone who registers, we'll send both links out of this recording and the past recording if you missed it. But that was a really wonderful webinar that we had. We invited auditors, a couple of the auditors that were present at the Synod, and they talked about the whole process of synodality and how welcoming it was and how young people were truly listened to at every step of the way across this, almost 2 or 3 year span of getting ready for the Synod on Young People in Rome. And so that was that webinar was a really excellent way of showing what happened at the Synod. So today we're going to go back and talk a little bit about the context and purpose and a little bit of the process, and what this final Synod document was written, among that process and that context. So Paul, I'm going to ask you to offer your insights about, any of the insights that you have on the context, purpose, and process of this final Synod document.
So the point of really the Synod experience was, the Holy Father coming off of the last Synod on the family, and that was the basis for Amoris Laetitia. At that Synod, there was a lot of conversation about young people specifically and how they were entering into that vocation of marriage, because they were talking about marriage and family, and just the discrepancy between the ideal of wanting more young people to really engage in that vocation and the reality where many young people were not. So that kind of started the thought process, 4 or 5 years ago during that experience. And then now coming in here, it really unfolded as, So what is the broader sense of vocation? So, that was a symptom. The fact that many young couples were not getting married in the church anymore was a symptom. And so it was trying to figure out what was the underlying issues. And so there was an exploration of the whole notion of vocational discernment, where what is the vocational call for all young people? Like, how are they making those decisions, and how is the church present in that decision-making process? So that was the big context of it. In the process of it, they also learned that there were evangelization questions that arose when talking about young people. The whole notion of evangelization and just engaging them just as Catholics, as Christians, as people of faith was something that was brought up. So a couple of those things filtered into the process. And then throughout the whole synod process, they just kept learning new things, because this synod process, like we had said at the last webinar, was unlike past synod processes. That this synod process involved a lot more consultation, dialogue with young people directly. It wasn't just talking about them, but talking with them, to them, and hearing from them. And that young people were present throughout the entire process, and that itself developed new things that the Holy Father and the Synod Fathers really recognized. So last October. So right now we're at the very end of February. At the end of October, we finished off. In fact, exactly on this day in October was when the Synod final document came out. And so it came out in Italian, and we kind of hurriedly tried to figure out what it said in English. We received the English translation just after the New Year, so we've been kind of, since the last webinar, we've had a chance to really both kind of grab that initial translation and then now also kind of decipher the official English translation, as well as the Spanish translation, the French translation, and every other translation that's out there, to really try and figure out what is it saying to us. So we're in this middle part. We were just informed that 1 month from, well, actually 1 month from the 25th, so March 25th so next month, we will receive the Holy Father's apostolic exhortation. So in a way, that is the organizational exclamation point to this 3-year process. So that is the Holy Father's kind of like, everyone always asks, who has the final word on this? Well, the Holy Father has the final word, and he has the apostolic exhortation is the last official word. And then from there, the actual final word is actually done locally in the implementation phase, which we'll get to shortly. But so right now we're just on the crest of, we've spent the last couple of weeks unpacking the final document, and we're anticipating the exhortation. In November of last year, the U.S. bishops, again, fresh off of having gone to that synod, the Synod Fathers addressed their brother bishops in Baltimore, and they laid out 7 ways to move forward. Really briefly, first dealing with openness and accountability as first, to encounter the peripheries, the accompaniment through synodality and dialogue, the idea of mentorship and formation as a very key component to the way we need more mentorship and formation in our ministries with young people. The idea that young people are protagonists, and so therefore are called to a sense of greater leadership in the church, and that space needs to be made for those young leaders, if that isn't there already, and that they take that lead. There was a notion of broadening the idea of the language of vocation and really understanding it as a core component to the core component of vocational discernment stems from the call to holiness. So that was something that needs to be unpacked. And then a renewal, and I dare say the word investment in ministry with young people, with youth and with young adults, that idea of a renewal of the ministries and an investment in those ministries needs to be emphasized and amplified as we move forward from this. So those were some thoughts that Bishop Caggiato, speaking with the other Synod Fathers, addressed to the brother bishops as things that they were going to start exploring moving forward. I, serving as their staff and kind of looking into those 7 areas that they presented, trying to find both on the national but also the diocesan and local levels, how those can be implemented in the United States. So, so we're kind of in the middle of things where we stand right now. We're, still unpacking, looking forward to, and looking in the midst of that implementation, which is yet to come. And some of it actually may already be happening. People may, there's no need to wait for implementation if people feel they have the opportunity to. So that's where we are, and that's the context in which we sit at this moment. So, but I'll really let Nick and Brenda really kind of explore that a little deeper. But is that helpful?
Wonderful. Yes, wonderful, Paul. Thank you. It's really, I love the way you put that this is such a different process and different style of synod because it was about talking with young adults, not about young adults.
Right.
And that's, I think that just that sentence right there could be the title of everyone's webinars,
Yeah.
And every hashtag line that we have.
I feel great. I was able to create a hashtag. I feel so honored.
We'll give Paul the credit for it. So Nick, I'll turn it over to you if you don't mind. What were your insights about the context and the purpose and the whole process here of the synod?
Sure. I mean, I think there's a question out there, did the synod do anything? And I think it's a really important thing to address here. And I came up with really kind of 4 things that I think that the synod actually did. And the first is we have to remember that it's the official title right here is that it's a synod of bishops on a particular topic. And so the primary audience of the synod is actually the bishops themselves. And that's, sometimes we lose sight of that. But so the first thing that I think that all of this did, and it's really clear to me from the document itself, is that it animated the bishops around this ministry. And not just those who were in the synod hall, but bishops around the world have been animated around youth and young adult ministry through this process and through that meeting in Rome. And I think that we can't underestimate what that means for the church. That's the first thing. The second thing I think is that what Paul just touched on in terms of the structure and the process of the synod. One of the things that this synod did was restructure future synods. And it gave a whole new process, and it set precedents that will now be carried forth, I think, in new synods that hadn't happened before. Even as the synods on the family, there were multiple synods there. There were lots of involvement, and there was consultation. It's still, even that one didn't happen the same way this one did in terms of the level of on the ground consultation. And who was included in the synod hall, right? We know and we can name who some of those auditors were in the synod hall and how many of them were there and what role they got to play in that. And we can't really go back from that now. And that's a really big step forward, is who's part of the process. And so we can't, and process, I know we look for results, especially as North Americans. We often are like, okay, what's the results? Give me, our business plan from here. Well, that's not how church operates. And I don't think it should be how church operates. The process, especially for Pope Francis, is the key, right? It's about setting the process in motion. It's not necessarily what the results are going to be and then working our way from there, but it's, okay, let's set the process in motion and see what happens. And so the process was set in motion around all of these questions around young people and vocational discernment and how this all plays together. So I think that that's the second thing. The third one is that there is implementation. People ask, okay, what did it do? Well, it's being done now. Implementation is happening on the ground in dioceses around the world, in our diocese around the United States, in religious congregations, in parishes, at diocesan levels. People have absorbed what's going on in the process and are doing things. They are implementing their own synods on young people in certain dioceses. They are taking key points from the different texts that have been generated. Remember, this is just one of probably a series of 5 major texts that have come forth from this process. And all of that has bubbled up and trickled down and it has made new things happen around the country and around the world. And the fourth one, this we'll get to in a little bit in terms of the text of this document. I think that there really are paradigm shifts that this document addresses. And so if we're answering that question of this webinar, my answer to that question is that yes, there have been paradigm shifts. I think that there are shifts in terms of how we define ministry as a church. There's also paradigm shifts around how we define vocation as a church. And there's a real sense of ownership now, a new sense of ownership or appropriation of the freedom of individual believers. And so I think those three paradigm shifts, along with some others that we can probably come up with, really do mean that something did happen. Right, something did change, and so we need to explore what those things are.
That's wonderful. Thank you for offering those 4 points, Nick. It's one of the I'm really pleased you talked about how the whole process of the synod itself is something to take note of. And I love the way you said we can't go back. Once we have this deep resonating participatory structure of the church, to move away from that would seem counterintuitive to the life of the church, so it's an excellent model. Wonderful. Thank you so much, Nick. Brenda, what insights do you have for us?
So I definitely echo what Nick said, about the process of being unique, bringing everybody to the table. But as a Hispanic minister, in the United States, we've been going with the Hispanic community through the process of Quinto Encuentro. So when we were going through the Synod process, for me, it was familiar, the process of consultation and bringing everybody to the table, not moving forward until we hear everybody's voice. So I was familiar with that process that is very particular of the Hispanic ministry in the United States and also in Latin America. But I think the language when the final document came out and seeing the language, and the progress of some topics, one of them being homosexuality. So how it was progressive from the first document, that came out from the preparatory document to the instrumentum laboris to the final document. And another topic that we saw a progress in the topic, or how it was mentioned in the document, or how often it will be brought up in the document, was singlehood as a vocation or not a vocation. And I think that's one of the paradigm shifts, that Nick was talking about, and I would like to talk about that more in depth in a little bit. But another of my impressions of feeling familiar as a Hispanic minister with the document was the road to Emmaus. Taking it as a road to Emmaus, definitely, once again, the Quinto Encuentro. But I think that's for us in the United States. What Nick said, this is not just for the United States, and sometimes we want immediate results. An example of how, I realize of how much advanced we are in the United States in ministry, and that we want everybody, the rest of the world, to be at our level, was when I realized that was at the lunch with Pope Francis. I had this blessing to be breaking bread with the Holy Father a month ago, and it was 10 of us from different countries, and Pope Francis wanted to hear from us, and he wanted to know what was in our hearts and what was happening, in our countries. And even the questions we asked were different. But until today, we are still in contact, with my brothers and sisters. And after the lunch, I told them, guys, we got to do something. There were hot topics at the table, and all of us can relate about that. We talk about the disaffiliation of young people. And that was actually a question that came from my friend from Africa. And I was like, oh, look, we have something in common. We're listening to them too. So, and other topics that were at the table that concerned to all of us. And I told them, guys, we got to do something. What about if we contact national representatives, you know, and the Episcopal conferences, and we can organize like an international day of prayer, and we can do this and we can do that. And I was like all excited, and they were just like, oh, probably like roll on that, you know. And I was so excited about this. But my brothers and sisters had no idea how to do that. Like they were like, no, there's no way we can reach out to the Episcopal conference. And I was like, guys, you were chosen, you were selected by your Episcopal conference to be there. But that doesn't exist in their minds, that doesn't exist in their countries, you know, the structure we have in the United States. And I told them, well, I'm paid, you know, to do ministry. And that was like unbelievable for them. They couldn't understand or believe that you can be paid, you can have a career doing ministry. So when I talk to them about some issues and about how to like address them and the work we're doing in the United States, they are not even understanding that that's even possible. So the fact that the Synod happened, bringing everybody at the table, that is just like the beginning of the conversation for many countries. And for us in the United States, can seem like, well, yeah, it was about time. So when we talk about the document and the results of the Synod, I think we need to keep in mind that the United States is advanced in the structure of the church.
That's really, thank you so much, Brenda. And you threw it in there that you had lunch with the Pope, which I hope when we go into our second session, definitely tell our viewers how that came about in the context of that. Because I think while many of us know about it, some folks may not. So I think they'd be thrilled to hear that. But, you know, it's just so deeply important the way you mentioned, and thank you for adding your insights. First off, the familiarity with this listening process with Fifth Encuentro it's so important to keep the connections between these national, you know, efforts at listening to young adults and to young people. And so thank you for making that connection for us as well. But also that idea, you know, the synodality that we talked about in our last webinar, and that we're kind of touching on here, this idea that we are all coming together, and that, you know, and I think, you know, Paul, I think you mentioned it as well, like, or maybe it was Nick, you know, the slow pace of things, you know, we want things, it's a process that we're going through. And that, Brenda, just like you had said, you know, we wanted more for young adults for so long, and the other parts of the world are still trying to get, you know, their bishops to listen to, you know, and their pastors to listen to young adult ministers at all, you know, in some ways. I don't know if I summed that up correctly or not, but just the differences that we have, and that this created a global conversation, you know, about ministry on young people. I mean, that's, you know, I love the term watershed, and I probably use it too much, but I think, you know, it makes you feel this is a true watershed moment in the listening life of the church. So thank you so much for that, Brenda. Go ahead.
I was also intrigued with Brenda. You mentioned that you still are in contact with those people, and that was a refrain we heard from the pre-synod, from the synod itself, and then from your gathering with the Holy Father. The fact that the young people are still, number one, thank the Lord, we live in a time when technology allows us to be in touch with people beyond the event, and that through, you know, WhatsApp or texting or Facebook or whatever, we can still stay connected. And in a sense, that sort of like side thing, like, hey, we all got together, the Holy Father or the bishops or whoever got us together, and now we're staying in touch after, is itself something that was noticed throughout the process as a best practice, that when you gather people together, thanks to the technology we have, you don't have to keep them together the whole time. You know, you can have them together for that mountaintop moment you obviously had, the people at the synod had, and then maintain that connection, and that sense of community can kind of build a sense of protagonism, but on a global or multi, you know, whatever it might be, you know, you don't have to, you know, whatever your geography is, it's not necessary for that community of young people or that community of leaders or whoever it is to mobilize together. And there's that strength in numbers that I think was noticed in every process that's gone on. I think that can't be, that's not a small thing that you keep in touch, and that there's still those, like, you're having conversations after the table that you would have had at the table. So I think that continues to build, and I think the Holy Father and the Synod wants that to continue, and that is a way of doing it.
Absolutely, absolutely. Thank you for that, Paul. I want to turn it over to everyone that has joined us, and again, thank you for those that came on a little after we began. I wanted to welcome you all, and thank you all for being with us today. We have what looks like a very wonderful group. We've got we've got Michael Horst from St. Meinrad's, and we've got folks from Grand Rapids. We've got people from all around. So I want to, the way our webinars work, we type in the bottom instead of getting all the mics on, because sometimes we'll get a terrible amount of feedback and things like that. So just type, if you see that little chat bar in the bottom there, you can expand it down. Ask questions or provide comments for our speakers today. Any thoughts that anybody has on the Synod process itself? We would love to hear from all of you, and see any questions we might be able to answer for you. One of the questions that I've had as we've been going through this process and talking about the Synod document, in terms of what's in there, as a practitioner, as somebody who, I'm thinking of a lot of my students in LIM, so we'll, in our graduate programs in ministry, I'll use these documents and we will study them. And that's in an organized kind of formal, setting in a classroom, virtual classroom often. But for those, do you have advice? Do any of the three of you have advice for how to use the document and maybe, to crack it open? It's long. That's so where I'm coming from is someone who's very short on time, someone who has, 1 million hats that they wear in their parish. What's a good way to get them thinking about this document?
So I think if we get by topics, more than the entire document, and just get a couple of phrases, because I think the document maintains the language, and it maintains the three specific, and I think Nick and Paul mentioned that, but the main topics that maintains is discernment, vocations, and accompaniment. Those three are like the main topics, and you can see it almost like in order, because he has a huge section on accompaniment, and then another section on vocations, and it explains about the different vocations. But if they are working with young marriages, because there are specific sections for young marriages or young families, getting that paragraph and have even a listening session with their young couples, or saying, this is what the document talks about. Is it familiar to you? Is this something that applies to your life? Is not, what can be done? Because I think what Nick said about this is not it. It doesn't give us, the document is just the framework of the reality and how we should see vocations, but it is not the answers. And the document specifies that it is up to the Episcopal conferences to now do something, to now put it in practice and dissect the document.
Yeah,
that's a great suggestion, Brenda, especially around those themes you mentioned. Wonderful. Go ahead.
I think that there's those themes, and I would echo everything that Brenda just said. Another couple of very practical ways that you can do this, right, are, and one of the ways that we've done this in dissecting it ourselves is to pull out a key word and do a text search for that keyword. So if you want to look at the vocational angle, search vocations or any kind of derivative of vocations, and you'll be able to really pull out the paragraphs that help. So I think that one of the things is that they are, the whole thing, it can't be absorbed at once. It's just too big to do that. But you can find a number of key themes running throughout and find the paragraphs that correspond to them. So if you're to take 10 paragraphs, right, on a particular topic, that's something that you can digest as a small faith study group, with your Bible study group, with, your pastoral council. There's ways you can do it. But of course, you're not going to give them all, 160 some paragraphs, but you can give them 10 and
Mhm.
say, here, this fits on, one sheet front and back, and we can look at this. So I think those are really important practical things to do. You're not doing any disservice to the document by doing that,
Mhm.
because what you'll find, especially in these documents, is that there's just nuggets of gold like
Yeah.
hidden throughout the document, and that's really what you want to be able to find there and say, okay, what can this help us do? I think the other is to really use it as look at the scriptures as the basis for looking at it. There's a lot of there's more scriptural quotations in here than I think a lot of people realize.
Mhm.
And there's a lot of scriptural basis for this, and to really say, okay, it's not just Emmaus. Emmaus frames the document, but there's so many other places and quotes in there from the scriptures that, doing some of those studies, and so doing, more of the biblical exegesis of the text, I think could be a really fruitful way to, find some really great inspiration in there, especially with young adults themselves. I think that, there's a number of really inspirational quotes that you can find, and most of those are really tied to how the Synod Fathers were able to pull out different pieces of scripture stories and say, hey, this reminds me of this, and this reminds me of this. And so I think that's another way that you can very practically kind of get it down.
I also noticed the document's actually much simpler than I think we think it is. It's actually done in a see, judge, act model.
Yeah.
So there's a little bit of repetition. So you'll find a concept that is, like for instance, the notion of, let's say art, or the use of art in music. So in the first section, it talks about how young people approach art in music as opposed to faith. The second section will talk about how, like kind of understanding that experience and kind of reflecting on it. And then the third part will talk about, here's some ideas of ways in which, some recommended best practices. So now it doesn't do that with everything symmetrically perfectly, but on many instances, you'll notice that the first section lays it out and says, this is what we're seeing. The second is, this is how we react to it. And the third section is, this is what we can do about it. That's kind of, in a simple way, how it is. So in a way of thinking that there's 160 paragraphs, there's actually probably about, maybe about 50, 60 ideas that are kind of repeated in that process of, this is what we see, this is how we think of it, and this is what we should do. And so you will find that. So it simplifies the document incredibly. And I think, again, digital technology, word searches in these documents are going to be your friend. So I have used that function on my computer more in reading this document than I've ever used it on anything else, because it's really nice to see how certain things, how many words repeat. Sometimes the word search function, if you try a company or a derivative of a company, you will break your word search function because it says there's too many to count. So obviously that's a very common word.
An important word.
That should tell you what's important. So
Right.
so those are just some things. So another way to look at the document is that that's a see, judge, act. That's how it's framed.
Yep.
Right.
Absolutely.
And the official translation, right, is not see, judge, act in this document, but recognize, interpret, choose.
Yes.
And so just to clarify for people, you're not going to find see, judge, act in here.
Don't search for that.
English translators of the Italian were, but it's recognize, interpret, choose.
Thank you for that. Thank you. We have a few questions going here, so I'll try and read as many as I can. We have John Pratt. Welcome, John. He asks us, did any of the bishops at the Synod feel they were becoming better teachers through listening? Could you sum up how listening and teaching should be combined in the role of pastoral leaders? That's a great question, John. Thank you for that.
I'll start, but I think I'll also acknowledge.
I'll jump in on the second part, so go ahead. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. I'll also acknowledge that both Nick and Brenda have, their bishops. I want to brag a little bit about Archbishop Laurie and Bishop Barnes. They are, for instance, excellent models of this listening. They weren't at the Synod itself, but they, through the encuentro process and through this process, have been listening bishops, and they're engaging in that process. So they weren't even there, and they were listening. The ones who were there, that was something that many of them did come back. You know, I was working with the bishops, and I would hear them on their return back to where they were staying each day. And many of them would say how the stories of the young adults, how that experience really opened their eyes, that for them was a very big discovery. I kind of liken it to a retreat experience. For many of them, you know, when you're on retreat, you hear stories of the other, you hear stories of other people and their journeys. And the bishops got a chance to practice their listening skills by, that was kind of what they had to do during the course of the synod process, was to listen. They had to listen to the people in the room. They had to listen to the studies that they had conducted for 2 years prior, the consultations. And I think that it really highlighted to them that that's the model of being church, that we should be a listening church. It's repeated many times in the document. And I think very practically, a number of those bishops who were there, I think, received that. And I think other bishops who have heard about this process and who have taken the document to heart are also saying we need to hear more stories. And so that's, I think, is, so from my experience working with them, I have seen that firsthand. And again, to brag about our two presenters and their bishops as well.
Wonderful. Thanks, Paul. Go ahead, Nick.
Right. I mean, and I've, in conversations with bishops that I've been privileged to have, including, you know, Archbishop Laurie, that it's very much been evident, right, is that you become a better teacher when you know who you're teaching, right? That's part of how you teach, right, and how people learn. You can only, you know, really meet people when you know them in terms of what they need to know. So part of this is, it's not just a matter of knowing all the content and imparting content, but you have to know who the person is in order to figure out what they need to know and what they don't know, which is what I want to go to in here. I think there's been a lot of talking in out there in terms of, okay, well, is the Emmaus model the right model for this kind of accompaniment, or for young adult ministry, for youth ministry? Is this really the right story? And then, but Jesus, you know, teaches a lot in the Emmaus story, but we don't hear a lot in this Synod document about teaching. What are some of those questions? And I can't, you know, sum up. I don't have the expertise to really fully answer your question, John, there in terms of what the right approach and how it all gets combined and best practices for pastoral leaders. But what I do notice is that one of the things that they're assuming in this document in terms of the listening and the teaching is that, and this is important about the Emmaus story itself, is that the Emmaus, the people on the road to Emmaus were disciples, right? They weren't people who didn't know the story. They weren't people who weren't involved in the community. And so I think a lot of times, especially in recent years in the US church, we've been so focused on the disaffiliation question, the evangelization question in terms of who's not part of the community. But that's not where this Synod document starts. It's not where the Synod fathers start in terms of how they're operationalizing and really kind of framing this ministry with young people. They start from the assumption that people are disciples on the journey, that everyone's walking on the journey. They do talk about those who aren't disciples, but that's not the primary frame of reference for the Synod Fathers. And it wasn't the primary frame of reference for who the Synod addressed in general and how the process unfolded. Right. So I think that's a really important piece here. And if you look through the document, as you start to interpret the document, it's important to remember that they really are assuming that they're talking to fellow disciples, right? So there are teaching moments, and they're there, and I think there's more of them than people realize in this document. But this is not about, it's not saying we need to start from a place that people don't know anything and nobody knows Jesus. That's not where this document starts. It starts with, we have a bunch of disciples and we need to continue to walk with them and to continue their journey of faith, which is a different place. And so what a lot of this listening is, okay, well, I've already been a disciple, but these are my struggles, right? I've already been a disciple, but these are my continuing questions. It's not my initial questions. It's not I've walked away. So I think as you look through what's in here, it's important to understand some of that frame of reference.
That's wonderful. Thanks, Nick. Go ahead, Brenda. Yeah.
For me, it means a lot that they chose the road to Emmaus.
Mm-hmm.
The road to Emmaus is known as a biblical passage by excellency that shows how to do ministry. And like Nick says, because it is not, Jesus is not talking to newcomers, it's talking to disciples. But even those of us who believe that we're already disciples, we forget about how to do things, and we want to be so quick on action and seeing results. When it comes to listening, the first action that we see happening in the road to Emmaus is not even the listening part, it's the observing. Jesus observes from far away, and then he comes close, which means that pretty much he's emerging into their reality, into what's going on in their lives in that moment. Not that Jesus didn't know, because he knew, right? It was
Right.
Jesus. But this is what I think the passage is inviting us to do, and what the Synod process invited us to do was to be immersed in that reality of the young people before even listening, and listen to know the reality, to know where they are coming from, not to answer, not to have results, but to first understand, and we can tell the people, I see you. So how important, and we cannot do this from our offices. And I think that's the biggest challenge for us ministers, that when we emerge in the reality of the young people, it cannot be done from a desk, It cannot be, when we build the relationships, when we listen to people, it cannot be done through a text message or emails. It means that we need to walk with them, we need to observe, and we need to get to know them and ask them, what is it going on? What are you talking about? And what are you talking about means, what are you carrying in your heart? What's going on? How do you see this? How do you see that? And then we can explain to people, what the passage says, and then Jesus explained to them. So then we can do this teaching moment.
Right.
But even after teaching, our role doesn't end. We continue walking with them. We continue accompanying them, and we don't force the people, to stay, and we don't force them to invite us in. But we break bread with them, which, in the language of breaking bread for us is building community. So how important after we listen and I get to know you, and it's not just listening one time, but it is this action of community, and then seeing it from the theological perspective, the Eucharist, right? And then we will go about the Eucharist and all of that. But then we leave, our time of living, and this is when accompaniment comes, our time to live is when they have opened their eyes by themselves. Yeah. When the disciples, the people we accompany, the young people, they have recognized Christ as their Savior, then we can move on. And I think that everything starts not even by the listening, it starts at observing and then walking with the people without talking, without having answers, without teaching, but just being present and knowing the reality.
Brenda, you had so many things to unpack there. That was wonderful. Thank you so much for that. One of the things that really came out in my mind, again, here's a new hashtag. It's not accompaniment versus, via email. I loved that. That was, like the bulletin is not accompaniment. Like an email blast that says join us isn't where this document is going, and what it means to be a listening church. And then, like you said, and I really want to affirm what you said very loudly, once we have listened and started teaching and figured out where to begin teaching after we've listened, we are not done listening, and that it doesn't end, So that was beautiful. Thank you. I want to chime in here. We have, let me scroll back up here. Steve has a really good question about the takeaways and from the bishops' meeting in November, and how we, was that the one? Well, there was a couple more. Well, in any case, takeaways and the renewal and willingness to invest in young adult ministry. And then Michael Horace has one about the potential impact. And so I want to come back to those questions, and we have a couple more. So we're not moving on without addressing those. But I do want to get us into the paradigm shift concept, because we talked briefly about that, and then Brenda, you also wanted to talk about your reflections on the vocation of singlehood as well. So I'm going to open it to back to you, Nick and Brenda, to offer your insights here. When it comes to implications for ministry, what are your reactions to the document?
Right. So, and I think that this is answering some of those questions and following what Brenda, you were just talking about, is the major paradigm shift here is how we see ministry, and it's ministry with young people, not ministry to young people or for young people. And historically, even doctrinally, that's a really big shift for us as a church. And it can be really uncomfortable, especially for us professional ministry people, right? Like I can serve you this way, right? But this is really, how can I serve with you, right? And that's a very different thing. And so I think that's one of the very tangible, practical, effects of this synod is going to be, okay, well, we're now walking and serving with young people. It's not just we're handing down from on high this to young people, and there's a real whole cultural shift that happens when we talk about that. But Brenda, go ahead and keep going.
So talking about the paradigm of what I see shifting here on the vocations of saying, well, it specifies, we see in the preparatory document, it does say what a vocation is, and that is not a state of life. But it is interesting because in page 4 of the preparatory document, it says, for each person, the vocation to love takes concrete form in everyday life through a series of choices which find expression in the states of life. Then between parentheses, we see marriage, ordained ministry, consecrated life. And then it's mentioned again, and same thing, it says something like whether through marriage, the ordained ministry, or the consecrated life, but it never mentions, not even once, the single life. It doesn't, is not like next to a vocation, not even in the state of life. And that to me was very interesting. I remember even getting a little bit offended when I read the preparatory document, because I'm single, in transition, hopefully that God shows me my vocation, but and I know he will, he's showing that, but I was a little bit like, come on, what about us single people that we are in our late 20s or early 30s, and so then in the Instrumentum Laboris, it specifically says that the young people had questions about this. And he talks about it on paragraph 105. It says, some BC wonder what vocational status those people have who chose to remain single without any reference to a particular consecration or marriage. It's now talking about it. It's now a question, and this is an example of listening. Not to answer right away, but the bishops are saying, wait a minute, we didn't even include that in the preparatory document. But now through the surveys and after listening to your questions, that's actually something we need to address, right? So then it comes to the Synod on Youth in the final document. On paragraph 90, it actually responds to that question, paragraph 90. And it says that the Synod reflected on the situation of people who live as singles, recognizing that this term can indicate a great variety of circumstances. It continues, and then finally it says, the Church recognizes that this state, lived in a spirit of faith and gift, can be one of the many roads by which the grace of baptism is realized and a person advances towards the holiness to which are called. So it says that it's many of the roads to live the gospel. Now, this is very interesting because the paragraphs before paragraph 90, all of the paragraphs include the word vocation in them, except paragraph 90. So I'm still a little bit, come on, but we see, Paul's gonna say something, but we see how like from the beginning, is not mentioned. And then we see that the bishop said, oh, the people have questions about this. And then we see the final document mentioning and stating that this is a road for us single people. And I don't know if other single people have encountered this, but I have encountered it in the church, and even coming from priests saying that pretty much what's wrong with me, that I am in a limbo because I'm not choosing a vocation. Paul?
Yeah, well, and the only thing that, as I look at that paragraph, I think there is a direction. There's not a commitment yet to classifying it as such, but I think it's number one. It's saying it's worth studying. It's saying it's something that we need to explore more, so that there is that openness to exploring this. But the last word of that paragraph is called, which is the same root word as vocation. So so I think that in there you do get a hint of movement towards this notion. So anyway, I think that my thought is it's an opening door from further reflection, conversation. Theologians, pastoralists, young people will need to continue to explore this, and I feel that the church probably will.
And that is important because, like you said, it is like cold, but it is not. It is a cold, and but it's also what the document says, that we are also called in our professions, right? And marriage people have a profession too. So it is, but what you said exactly, this is beautiful that the church is open to the conversation.
Yeah.
And that is the paradigm shift that I see happening here. We are starting to have conversations about this. So yeah, I will say that about that one.
Yeah,
that's great. Go ahead.
I'll continue on this vein. So that's in part 2, right, on the interpreting or judging section of this document. All of those pieces, and I think that that is an underappreciated section in general of this document, because it really does open up all of this understanding of vocation. That's this is the young people, the faith, and vocational discernment. And vocational discernment, that's the heart of what that second section there is. But we do come back to it, as Paul mentioned, in the third section. And that's really important. Okay, so what do we choose? And this is where I think it gets even more exciting than the fact that we got a paragraph on singles. It doesn't say the word vocation, but it does say called. Where we see that there has been significant movement, but it gets even farther down that line of movement when you get to paragraphs 138 through 141. So you're deep into the choosing section. What are the bishops, what does this whole synod process say we should be choosing? And they're saying that we need to shift our entire youth and young adult ministry approach to be one from a vocational discernment perspective, right? So this is the challenge to professional youth and young adult ministers, especially in the United States, who have gone, that has not been the paradigm out of which they've been operating, right? We have not been operating out of a vocational perspective. And this is saying, no, this is the hinge, he uses that word, this is the hinge on which everything else turns, right? Because really having somebody understand their vocation, their calling in life, is what this whole point of becoming an adult is about, right? And it's a process of growth into adulthood, right? It recognizes very clearly, right? This is not a stage into itself, but it's a process of growth into adulthood. Part of that process is choosing to accept God's call for you. But I think we have to be very careful also, especially in our US context, that we don't confuse this with the way we've come to talk about vocation in a professional context in terms of what job. This is not career counseling. And I think that we can fall very easily into that trap and equate it to work, right? Vocation in the church is not about what work do I do, right? It's so much deeper. And I think that that's a challenge also to us. It's not, okay, what work are you going to do in the world, but who are you and who do you belong to? Are the, it's not, and that's how Pope Francis frames this, right? It's not especially even about who am I, but whose am I? Whom do I belong to? And that's a really key insight that I don't think we get there very often with our youth and young adults in those conversations. It's great that they can pick a good career path. It's great that they can give back and they can serve and they can do all the things that we want them to do in the world, right? But most fundamentally, God is calling them to something much deeper about who are they, right? And so I think that those are really key questions here that come back in this and really challenge us to reframe how we're looking at our ministry. And you find that there deep in the document in part 3.
You know what you're saying, Nick, it's crucial about the identity of who we are. And I think what the document talks about, and we cannot confuse about work, because it does talk about professions. It does talk about the young people, but the context is putting it is that we are disciples, that we need to teach them to be Christians and live out their Christian values in anywhere they work. If they work in law enforcement, then be a good disciple doing law enforcement. If you are a teacher, be a good disciple at teaching. In my conversations with young adults, I think there is this, I say like a disparity. They say, well, I don't know if I should be a liar or be a good Catholic. And I'm like, what's, why you cannot be a good Catholic exercising law enforcement, or being a lawyer? And we need to work with our young people and our young adults in this area in helping them to first live out their values and be good disciples. During the lunch with Pope Francis, he said, be like rooted trees, because the trees that are not rooted dry out. And I think that being rooted in our values, in who we are as Catholics, And if we are rooted trees, then we can grow, in any soil. We can give our shadows to others. But talking about the challenge for professional ministers, what Nick was talking on passage 140 and 141, that struck me when I read it, when it says it's proposing to all the national Episcopal conferences to do a directory of youth ministry, prepare from a vocational perspective. And that's a huge challenge. But then on 141, it says that having different offices is great. And I think that applies for the United States, because in other countries, they don't even have offices. But that having a lot of offices is great, but then it can be the multiplication of offices. Instead of being fruitful, it can be like create disruption, So it says that we should pass from a work for offices to a work for projects. I think that it is a call for all of us to get in contact with our diocesan offices and come to the table and say, how can we work in this project, in this issue, instead of working independently, but working together. And another thing that I found, like this idea of where we can collaborate for young adult ministers, for professional ministers, is when he talks about the preparation for marriage. That's another thing that he says, that we need to help the young adults, in the preparation for marriage, not only after marriage or before marriage, but even after marriage, at least for the first years. And that's one area that we are not working in our ministries, when we talk about young adults, but they are also family ministry now. So it's this collaboration with the family life offices, or whatever name we have in our office, in our diocese, and young adult ministry. But another part that I was looking at this, that I was like, yes, please, we need a conference. It's with the seminarians. It changed the paradigm, when it talks to the preparation of the seminarians. it says that the seminarians need to continue being in communities, and that it is preferably to be like small communities, not that big, but not too small either. It says that the seminarians need to work with teams, within teams, and it also says that those teams need to include women. And that in order to, and a lot of like lay people, to avoid clericalism grow in their hearts, you know, and in their minds. That it was just like, we need a national conference of young adult ministers and vocational directors. How can we collaborate? Not on recruitment, not for them to come to our young adult ministries and talk about the vocation, but how can we collaborate that we young adult ministers have a say in the process, in the formation process of the seminarian? Because yeah, it gives like a lot of, I love that part. I'm actually going to talk to my vocations director later today, because he talks a lot about the seminarians being involved in the communities, and they are young adults, you know. It's not separating the seminarians from talking about the young people. They are young adults. So I think that collaboration between offices and projects.
That's wonderful. Thank you, Brenda. I don't want to cut anybody off, but I do want to go to the folks that have been typing in some questions. And we're getting a little short on time, so I wonder if there's a way we could combine. We have a question from Steve, and then we have a question from Michael Horace. And I wonder if, in terms of the toolbox. So, and it's kind of to you, Paul, and to anybody else, but there is a reference to you, Paul, and to the USCCB. One is about, Steve's asking about the financial challenges. And so while, the Synod is recognizing the need, I'm paraphrasing Steve, so I hope I'm getting you right here, recognizing the need to invest in resources and invest in young adult ministry, but we're so low on finances, and that's another issue. And then is there sort of a toolbox that the USCCB might put together of like maybe best practices or online resources for advocacy of the Synod? So I'll put those to you, Paul, and then, Nick and Brenda, any thoughts you have too?
Yeah, well, I of course, working at the conference, I defer to the wisdom of our bishops to kind of really take this and run with it. I will certainly assist them if they are looking for ideas and raise up some of these as ideas. But, the document does call for that national directory of sorts, and what that means is a pastoral plan. And the bishops have, with past documents, after Evangelii Gaudium came out, the bishops came out with a pastoral plan on evangelization called Living as Missionary Disciples. After Amoris Laetitia, the bishops they haven't yet, but they are, there is some possibility, if they approve, that there will be a pastoral plan on marriage and family. After this, if the pattern should continue, there will probably be some sort of pastoral plan, a directory, and again, keeping in mind that vocational slant we were talking about before. So that's certainly something that will certainly come out. And I'm sure that will involve tools and resources that will accompany that, just as these other resources that come out from the bishops have. Now, that could be a couple of years to come, so I don't want people to wait, and there are good things that are actually out there. So one thing is our national advisory team can help point you in the direction of currently existing resources and tools and things like that. I mean, in a way, by doing this webinar is a tool and a conversation tool. So I thank Loyola New Orleans for providing that. And there are many other collaborating organizations that also have existing tools. And then, eventually, maybe perhaps the conference will provide some tools. But we already have some great tools that are out there, and we can kind of point in that direction. And in terms of the funding for it, there is a prophetic piece to this. That in the era of disaffiliation, it may be tempting for people to say, let's circle the wagons and trim and cut. But rather, this is the very time in which we probably should actually invest double in things like this. So it does require a little bit of propheticness. And so, I think that as lay Catholics, I think advocating to our pastors and to our bishops for the need for this. If this is a need in your community, then certainly raise that up for that. And where there is need, hopefully there will be investment as well. But and also, where can we invest and where can we find other resources and other people, other collaborators One of the things that we have done on a national level is look for good collaborators in the ministry field. And when there's collaboration, there can be financial collaboration as well. So people often want to work. So I encourage people on the ground, don't just wait for the church to just open up some sort of secret vault of money that fictionally exists, but rather seek out people who can collaborate and work together. And there, together you might be able to find some financial resources that can assist even in the short term while we continue to advocate for that in the bigger picture.
Thank you for that, Paul. Thank you. I want to, and feel free, Nick and Brenda, to chime in. We also do have another really good question from, let me scroll up here. I think I lost it. From Judith, and how the Synod, every time somebody types something, it disappears, how the Synod can reach out to people on the peripheries, I think it was. So thank you for that question, Judith. Those that aren't in our parishes, any quick strategies? We will have a webinar next week that's really going to get into the parish, diocesan, and parish level, and some real good strategies that we can pull out of the Synod document. So stay tuned for that next week. But anything you can say right now about, kind of going out to the peripheries, those that are not in our parishes, those young adults?
The document does have a section in there in the 140s, paragraph 140s, which again is in that action, that choosing section of the document on some specific periphery groups to really pay attention to. Migrants, those in poverty, women in particular are highlighted as well. Thank you, Brenda, for raising that earlier. But those are different peripheral groups that we in the community may miss. Those who are disabled, the deaf community, they kind of raise up a number of different communities that are out there that are there, and they kind of give some broad sense of direction. They aren't giving action items. Again, that's ultimately for us to implement. But those paragraphs, the 140s, is where you're going to find a lot of that attention towards what are the action steps the church needs to take towards the peripheries.
Right. Some other specific paragraphs to look at are 126, 127, and 129 and 130. And especially 130, especially if this is coming from a parish angle, is a crucial paragraph to share with pastors, pastoral councils, parish staff members. And it's talking about open and decipherable structures. It's saying that, it recognizes staff people around the world, ministers, whether they're volunteer or paid, are doing incredible work. Whether you're a priest or a sister or a bishop, we know that people are doing good things. But over time, and through no fault of their own, often those good works get lost in a kind of fog of church speak and church structures and things. And so one of the main things in terms of reaching out to those in the peripheries is that we have to really do a critical self-examination of how open and decipherable are the works that we're doing, the communications that we have with people. How is that working? Because so often it's not a matter of that. Even once we reach out to people, they're still going, but that doesn't make sense. I don't understand what you're talking about. So I think that those are some really critical pieces here to look through in terms of reaching out to the peripheries as well. Because it's not just a matter of going out and finding people, but there's a lot of people who try to find the church in all sorts of senses and go, I think I'm looking for this, but it doesn't make sense. So how do we fix some of those problems as well?
I think paragraph 143, it gives a specific idea. It says that we need to move away from the idea of static centers, that we need to pretty much meet people where they are, and go to the schools and the communities. And I will say an example of this. So when people are not coming, it's either because they don't think that you are providing what they need, you're not important in their life, or it's a lack of trust. Yeah. So, and to build trust with a community, it takes time. It's relational ministry, but it's not about visiting them one time or giving them one phone call. It's about being persistent and being there. An example of this, when I used to be a community organizer many years ago, And there was this community that I wanted to like come and work with, and it's an indigenous community from Oaxaca. And yet I'm Mexican, but they wouldn't trust me. They will only trust their own people, and I couldn't even like come and meet with them. So it took for me to find one person that will come and introduce me to them, so that way I wouldn't be an outsider. And then it took me a lot of time of just visiting them without even asking any questions, just going and having lunch with them and having dinner. And I will take them stuff like food or different things here and there, until one point they trusted me and they knew that my intentions were being genuine, that I wasn't there just to like get their signatures as an organizer. But seeing it from the church perspective as a minister, it is the same thing. We cannot just expect a community to just trust us. Let's say the young people who are, how to say, like, oh my gosh, at risk, at risk communities. We cannot just come one day and expect them to be coming to our parish just because we went to their neighborhoods once. So we need to gain their trust, of the peripheries, identify the periphery, and then be in the periphery, be immersed, but not going with our heels and our blazers, but actually be, and assimilate to the community, merge with them, and then get their trust just by showing our genuine concern about the community, and that we don't just want to bring numbers.
Yeah, that's beautiful. Thank you so much for that, Brenda. We had one more question that Paul was addressing, and I just want to bring attention to that. We had Charlotte who asked, about after coworkers in the Vineyard of the Lord came out, there was all these kind of national conversations and collaboration. And we do have, thank you for that, Charlotte. And Paul's note, I'll just alert everybody to it. The nationaldialogue.info is an effort to bring, break down these silos, to go out to the peripheries, to start, to host a conversation with young people. And then have them identify young people that are not present. Like you said, Brenda, having someone, a connection between communities, between people on the peripheries. So the National Dialogue is a really excellent way to get that. If you're nervous on how to start it, it really helps set all of that up, and all the documents are on the website for how to facilitate a conversation and how to structure those. So I want to bring this to a close here today. Oh, this is from the last that one's from the last webinar. Sorry about that. I forgot to get the slide off of there. And I want to thank, on behalf of Loyola Institute for Ministry, I want to thank our presenters, Brenda and Nick, and Paul for coming on with us today. Paul was going to co-facilitate, but he had so many insights that we thought he should be on it too. So I want to thank you all so much for joining us here today. And Diana is on the call, I think, still, and she's going to put up a link right now. So if you did not have a chance to register on the Google form, please do that, because then that's how I have your email, so that you can send this link in this recording to anyone who missed it. And I'll also send the link to the previous webinar recording. So absolutely make sure you can register there. And then that's how I will send out the link for next week's webinar. And so next week coming up, we have, we're very excited. A week from today, actually, we're going to do implementation strategies for your local diocese. So it's going to be about disrupting ministry and bringing the Synod to life in your local area. So I look forward to that. It's probably going to be at the same time. We're still nailing down the time, but it's probably going to be 2 Eastern. So again, thank you, Brenda, and thank you, Nick and Paul, for joining us here today.
Thank you, Tracy.
Thank you.
Thank you, Tracy.
Thank you, and I'll let you know. Thank you for joining us. And if you want any more information about the Loyola Institute for Ministry and our pastoral studies degrees in religious education, we have the link right there. And so, like I said, please register on the form, and we'll send this recording to everybody. And happy Mardi Gras, everyone, and happy Lent.
And Punchki Day for my Polish brothers and sisters.
That's right. That's right. All right. Thank you to all who attended. Thank you so much. Have a wonderful day.